We learned 2 years ago about the beautiful parallels and similarities between Shavuot and Pentecost. Shavuot, a biblical holiday that tells us 7 weeks after Passover, we celebrate the end of the barley harvest. And then during the rabbinic period, the rabbis overlaid on Shavuot this notion that it was on Shavuot itself that the Torah was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. Now, however you understand Revelation, however you understand the text coming into our possession, there have been throughout the generations those teachers who've wanted to know what's the essence of it all. If you have to boil it all down to just one teaching or 2 teachings or 3 teachings, how do you take something as complicated as Torah and try to make sense of it in a way that you can wrap your head around? A little bit later, Pastor Fisher is going to teach us about the parallel with Pentecost. If Shavuot teaches us about receiving Torah, Pentecost teaches us about receiving the Holy Spirit. We're going to learn more about that later in some of those beautiful parallels. But the question is, what is revelation? Now, traditionally, revelation describes the act of making known that which was previously hidden. Revelation is making known that which was previously hidden. And in our tradition, in our shared traditions, it refers to the revealing of God's will, God's teaching. So the question I want to start our learning this evening around is, what is God's will for us? What does the gift of Torah, because in our Jewish tradition, we call this evening Shavuot Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of Torah. So what is revealed to us in this gift? And as I mentioned, throughout the ages, different teachers have come up with different attempts to try to reduce Torah to its very essence, which is very helpful because, again, when you take something like the 5 books of Moses, that's a lot of words. How do you keep that straight in your head as you walk through this world? The prophet Micah, he reduces Torah to 3 principles. He says, Uma Adonai doresh mimcha. What does God demand of you? Do this, only this. Do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. Hillel, a sage who appears in the Talmud repeatedly, he sums up Torah in just one teaching. He says, what is hateful to you, do not do that to another. And then he said, this is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and study. Zil u'gmor. There's lots of learning to do, but the basic principle is what is hateful to you, do not do to another. Later in the New Testament tradition, of course, Jesus teaches that in the opposite. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Rabbi Akiva, who lived in the 1st and 2nd centuries, he said the principle, the essence of Torah is ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. He says this is a klal gadol b'Torah. This is the essential meaning of Torah. And I want to share with you tonight a much more contemporary attempt to try to reduce Torah to its essence, and it comes from a 20th century sage. So I'm going to flash forward from the time of Micah before the Common Era to the time of Hillel in the 1st century before the Common Era, Akiva 1st, 2nd century. I'm going to flash forward all the way to the 20th century. Emmanuel Levinas is a French Jewish philosopher who understands the teaching of Torah in this way, and it's not a super long quote, but it's kind of a long quote, but it's so dense and so powerful that I want to share it with you tonight. He said, to follow the Most High is to know that nothing is of greater importance than the approach made towards one's neighbor. I want to repeat that. To follow the Most High, so that means to really walk in the way of God, is to understand that nothing is more important than the approach made towards one's neighbor. The concern with the fate of the widow and the orphan, the stranger and the poor person, and that no approach, listen to this part's very important, no approach made with empty hands can count as an approach. No approach made with empty hands can count as an approach. And where does Levinas, where does he get this central truth in Torah? He says, I learned this through the traumatism of my enslavement in Egypt, which constitutes my very humanity, that which draws me closer to the problems of the wretched of the earth, to all persecuted people. So for Emmanuel Levinas, who himself survived the Holocaust and witnessed horrors unimaginable, but he finds this truth in this distant memory that is felt in a very deep way in our Jewish tradition, the trauma of slavery. Now, evidence that this is, in fact, the central teaching of our tradition is abundant. Again and again, we are urged in the Torah, in the Bible, to worry about the needs of the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor. We're commanded to give tzedakah, charity, to perform acts of loving kindness, gemilut chasadim. But for Levinas, importantly, ritual teachings of our Torah also point to this truth. For him, just being a mensch, a good person, is not all that is required of us as human beings. Performing particular acts help us to follow the Most High. The liturgy, our shared liturgy, so many of these texts point us towards this. When we give thanks before and after a meal that we share, when we remind ourselves of our duty to help others, that's when we feel this teaching. When we celebrate Shabbat, when we celebrate the Sabbath, when we celebrate holidays, that's when we feel this teaching. So each year on Shavuot, we grapple seriously with what it means to ask that question, what is it that God demands of us? What is revealed to us through our tradition? And tonight we're focusing on what is revealed to us through our shared tradition. What is the essence of our Torah? And I want to leave you with that call from our shared tradition as voiced by Levinas, that what constitutes this answer to the question, what is it that God requires of us, is the approach made towards one's neighbor. And I'm so grateful to Pastor Fisher and to the entire Greater Zion Church family for the relationship that we are developing. And I hope that for many years to come, we'll find opportunities as neighbors to come together and to ask these kinds of questions, and in partnership, hand in hand, to confront those challenges as neighbors, whether it's the challenge of racism, whether it's the challenge of anti-Semitism, whether it's the economic challenges that so many in our city face, whether it's a loss of a sense of a shared truth, even a sense of what truth can mean in a world where truth is assaulted in so many powerful ways. These are the kinds of questions we need to be asking, and these are the kinds of partnerships that I hope that we'll continue to work on together. And I just want to remind everybody here, if you didn't remember how it is that we even came together, our communities, it was almost 2.5 years ago, January of 2020, when our dear friend, Bishop Ken Ulmer, called us together and said, let's bring our communities together. Members of the Jewish community, members of the Black LA community, particularly in the Christian world. Let's come together and let's stand up against anti-Semitism. And soon the pandemic was upon us, and soon it was a summer where we were asking important and deep and seemingly questions that had been asked and answered before about systemic racism in our country. And Pastor Fisher reached out to me, and some of us came down to Greater Zion, and we were together in that night where we thought about the breaths that we take, and we thought about lives that had been taken away from us, including the life of George Floyd. We said, we're going to stand together. And so it was that sense of being neighbors, that sense of a shared concern and a shared passion for trying to not just bring our communities together, but to think about how God is calling us and how God is revealing to us that central truth. And it is that shared memory of our trauma, whether it's the trauma of slavery in Egypt or the trauma of the 20th century horrors that the Jewish people saw, the trauma of slavery in America that so many of our black brothers and sisters remember as if it were yesterday, the continuing trauma of systemic racism, the continuing trauma of anti-Semitism in this country. These are the kinds of things that bring us together. So I couldn't be more grateful to you, Pastor Fisher, and to your community for being with us. The question that will lead us to our next song is really, how can we be God's partners in building a world of love and a world of compassion together, a world where we can celebrate all the different ways that we are connected and celebrate all the different ways that together we can bring a sense of compassion and love into the world.